Well, good morning to everybody. Welcome to what is always considered to be the highlight panel of the conference, as compared to all the other panels, which are also the highlight panels of the conference. We're going to be covering the world on this panel. It's the future of digital policy in the global economy. Don't worry, I don't know what that title means either, other than the fact that it gives us carte blanche to talk about just about anything of interest that's going on in the digital world globally. We have, as always, an extraordinary panel. Their bios are in the book, with Susan Ness's being in the addendum, just to make sure that you know about that. So I will skip over the bios. What we're going to be doing is having short initial presentations by each of the panelists. Then we're going to have a series of questions, and the questions will probably also be, I'll be asking some questions immediately after each of the panelists, as usual. And then I expect that we will have time to come to you all in the audience to ask the really penetrating and insightful questions to ferret out what really is going on. So with that, Julie, would you like to start us off?
Sure, I'm happy to, and thanks for having me, and thanks to Tom for, as always, and Jane, wherever she is, for putting on a wonderful conference. I thought what I would do is just since I'm first, is kick things off by talking a little bit about some of the things that I think about in terms of the future of the digital economy, and I think the two biggest questions, in my view, are how do we handle the different norms around the world, and then probably a secondary question is, how different really are those norms? And I think that these conversations, or this conversation about those issues, needs to be focused on kind of US-European relationships, as well as what's happening in Asia, and then around the rest of the world. So I only have a couple of minutes, so I thought what I would do is just kick off issues that I think about when I think about these different regions, and maybe then we can just dive into them, to the extent that we've got time. So when it comes to U.S.-Europe policy with respect to the digital economy, I think one of the big issues is the different views of the role of national security and the extent to which national security ought to have a part in how we think about privacy, how we think about other digital issues. But a very important subsidiary issue that falls right under that is which are the institutions that make those decisions about national security and the role of national security when it comes to data flow and privacy. So for instance, in the European Union, you see some institutions making these decisions or arguably making decisions about national security where one wonders about their competency when one actually looks at their charters and whether they're really supposed to be thinking about national security issues. And then on the United States side, there's a lot of concern, I think, around transparency issues, some of which have been addressed in USA Freedom, but some of which I think could use a lot more improvement, certainly from the European perspective. Another big issue when it comes to EU-US digital policy and seeing whether or not we can actually sort of move together to develop a policy that will work, are issues that were mentioned on the last panel. And that's the notion of consumer harm versus citizens' rights. And I actually don't think that there's such a big difference between those two perspectives, because I do think in the United States we often forget the notion that we actually do have fundamental rights when it comes to digital digital issues and the free flow of data, particularly around free speech. And then when you look at what's happening in Europe around in the GDPR, and also this may come up in Privacy Shield within a year or two, concerns around automated profiling and questions about what are the rules going to be around automated profiling. Well, in fact, the United States has actually addressed many of those concerns through the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And one of the most interesting things that I have to mention this, and forgive me if I go a little over my time, but it's always remarkable to me that my European colleagues, because I spend a lot of time in Europe trying to explain the United States privacy system, because it isn't very transparent in the way that the European law appears to be more transparent. And I explain things like the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and I explain things like the adverse action notices that are given to consumers when data is used that could harm them for sensitive purposes like employment, insurance, housing, credit. And they're floored that the United States has actually dealt with this and gives notices to consumers when data is used in a way that can harm them. And they're just now starting to develop some of these notions around automated profiling to try to deal with that. Another big issue, I think, is going to be in Europe, US, digital policy, obviously Privacy Shield, obviously standard contractual clauses, which are now going to be challenged. What will the future for adequacy decisions and adequate transfer mechanisms be? And I hope we can dive into that a little bit. And then, of course, the GDPR and what companies and everyone's going to need to do to get ready for that. But it would really be a shame if we don't mention Asia. I mean, we really do need to, Europe and US are very important, but Asia is a very, very important part of the economy too. And the APEC region has developed some mechanisms for adequate transfer of data. It's the cross-border privacy rules regime. The problem is that there really hasn't been much uptake on these rules. You see the United States, Mexico, Canada, and Japan have adopted the CBPRs, but other very important countries in Asia have not and are much more skeptical about CBPRs. Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea have in different ways sort of somewhat said, well, maybe these will be okay, but we really don't accept them now, and we'll look at them, and others have said, no, these aren't going to be good enough. So I think the future in Asia is still to be written in terms of the digital policy and in terms of data flow. And I think one of the big questions will be whether the Asian nations start to develop adequacy regimes also. They have whitelisting provisions, which look similar to adequacy decisions, and I think that's something we should talk about. Finally, the last issue that I think we all need to talk about is localization. And will we see more and more countries develop data localization rules? Will they be able to point to the Microsoft decision as a reason why they should be doing this? Because isn't this really sort of what the fundamental point of the Microsoft decision was? And of course, now we have legislation which will try to correct some of that impression, dealing with MLAT, dealing with not requiring data localization in order for law enforcement to access data. But the future of that legislation, I think, is anybody's guess at this point.
So, Julie, you mentioned the importance of Asia.
Yes.
So who's leading in the world? Are we leading? Is Europe leading? Is it chaos out there where everybody's just trying to figure it out in a unique fashion? Where's the leadership?
So that is a great question, and
Thank you.
And I think that the obvious, look, that is it's also a very subjective question. I think if let me answer it by saying what the Canadians say, okay? Because the Canadians, right, are sort of in between both worlds. And I have heard the Canadian data protection supervisor, Danielle Terrien, who's a wonderful man. If you all don't know him, you should get to know him. Say the following two things. Number one, who appointed Europe to be the privacy czar of the world? So, which implies that Europe is leading and driving policy. And then on the other hand, I have also heard him say, the United States needs to get their act together because the rest of the world is just going to leave it behind. My personal view is that if Washington continues to not step in and deal with some of these critical digital issues, as I feel that Congress, Congress has a lot on its plate. There's a lot of other issues they need to deal with. But if they're not going to deal with ECPA, if they're not going to deal with now ICPA, or is that how we pronounce it? ICPA? Sorry. ICPA, if they're not going to deal with MLAT issues, then policy will be driven elsewhere. And it will be driven by Sacramento and Brussels, I think. And I think the rest of the world will follow those two leads.
Adam?
So I'll offer a little bit different answer to your question to Julie, which is that I think that the U.S. has been too bashful in evangelizing our approach to internet regulation to the rest of the world. We regularly come in for criticism. Commissioner Brill, Chairwoman Ramirez, the Commerce Department, State Department regularly get attacked by foreign policymakers for our internet regulation for being too lax compared to what they're doing. And I just don't think that's right, and I don't think that's reflective of of our regulatory model. Every week, foreign policymakers trek to Silicon Valley, visit the campuses of Facebook and Google and Uber and LinkedIn, et cetera, and they all ask the same question: how can we create our own Silicon Valley in our country? Now, granted, Silicon Valley is a special place. I'm sure the weather and access to venture capital and proximity to Stanford and UC Berkeley play a big part in that. But it is worth being proud of the fact that Silicon Valley and the world's leading technology companies have been born in the United States. And I think that is at least a reflection, at least in part, of the fact that we have developed a set of foundational laws here that strike, I believe, in a very important balance between technological innovation on the one hand and consumers' rights on the other. So just a couple of examples. Our laws reflect a bias in favor of data innovation. We think that services can innovate in data in really fascinating ways to create new services. We are also biased in favor of the free flow of data. We don't have data localization requirements in this country. Our laws reflect a bias towards free expression. We think internet services ought to reflect the dynamism and the opinions of society across the board. We have liability protections for online services that host third-party content. That's all because we believe that that's essential to the dynamism of those platforms while still allowing for objectionable content to be removed. We have copyright protections combined with essential limitations like fair use and notice and takedown systems. We have a sector-specific ex-post approach to privacy that focuses on harms to consumers, transparency and choice. And as Commissioner Brill said, I believe that we should be proud of the fact that our consumer privacy laws are in many ways the most consumer protective in the world, right? We shouldn't be ashamed of that fact. We also have set up a system of responsiveness to law enforcement requests. We're reflecting that internet and other online platforms need to produce data and investigations to law enforcement, but we make sure that those requests are narrowly tailored, and we make sure that we have appropriate due process. The best due process, the strongest, most citizen-friendly due process in the world. And so I think we ought to be proud of the fact that we've struck the right balance. As Commissioner Brill and others have noted, unfortunately, we've seen over the last few years that our approach has become under a criticism. I think we see threats to that approach, particularly in Europe, but elsewhere. We see terror attacks leading governments to pass anti-encryption laws and localization requirements. We see ideas like the right to be forgotten spread from Europe to Latin America and Asia. And I think that we also see, a false notion that U.S. tech platforms are succeeding at the expense of non-U.S. smaller players, when I don't think that reflects the way that platforms enable the success of a European SMB, helping that small business sell their goods across borders, of the way that iOS or Android help a company like Spotify get their services to more consumers. And so I think it's actually, we're at an interesting moment where I would propose that the U.S. be more aggressive about evangelizing our approach to the rest of the world, that we've gotten the balance right here. And I think we have an interesting moment with the likely election of Hillary Clinton. As of this morning, I saw it checked on 538. The odds of her becoming president are 86% as of this morning. And it's about 6 years ago, when she was Secretary of State, she put forward an internet freedom agenda that was very focused on human rights and using the internet as a tool for human rights. I think it's actually maybe time for us to update that internet freedom agenda, this time with an economic focus, to be a global internet opportunity agenda that sells our approach to internet regulation to the rest of the world.
Well, thank you, Adam. Let me ask a follow-up, if I could, on the point you're just making. Is it really a question of that we're not strong enough as advocates to voice the wisdom of our approach, or do you think it's that they know that our approach has been successful? You point out that virtually every country comes to Silicon Valley, comes to Washington, asks what's special about the water and how can they replicate this? Or so is it the fact that we don't do a good job of selling, or do they know what we're doing and they're really just trying to change the rules of the game globally in order to retard the advance of our interests to the benefit of their economic interests?
I don't agree with that last point. Frankly, I think Commissioner Brill has had more interaction with global policymakers, and I'd be curious what Susan, Wolfgang, and Matt and others think about this. But I think it's probably a combination of two things. One is that I think there's probably a little bit of a strong disagreement that our regulatory framework contributes to the success of U.S. companies. I think they think it's the other things, right? It's the other things that we've put in place. Again, maybe it is sort of those Silicon Valley elements. I don't know that there's much acknowledgement of the notion that our regulatory framework has been an essential ingredient to the success of U.S. companies. So that would be my thesis again on it.
Before we go to Susan, Julie wants to jump in here.
Yeah, well, just really quick, on digital single market, though, I do think that they're looking at sort of trying to replicate some of the rules in the U.S. But just to be clear, I completely agree with you. I mean, when I go in Europe and have given speeches and still am giving speeches, I talk about how good the U.S. system is. It's complicated. And I don't think it's perfect. Look, it could use improvement in the ways that you talked about, I talked about. Think about data brokers, think about other issues that really should be addressed here. But it is quite good. I think one of the reasons why others in the US government don't evangelize in the way that you think they should, and I think they should, is because it's not easy to do. It's not easy to explain the US system. You have to know it, and you have to know it deeply to understand. I interpreted your question on who's winning to be not who should win, which is I think what you asked, but who indeed is winning. And I think that's a different question. So who should, I think you and I are in agreement that there's a lot to be said for the US system, and indeed other regions of the world may want to copy it if they could. Whether they have the conditions to do so is another question. But I do think indeed a more European approach dealing with adequacy and also some of the issues around data localization do seem on the ground to be winning out right now, and then the question becomes why.
And I also think the Europeans, they are winning in terms of their approach, spreading. They invest more time and energy in evangelizing their approach to the rest of the world than the U.S. does.
Well, and also, unless you're adequate, unless you copy their regime, then you've got to deal with the privacy shield kind of thing. So other countries are saying, gee, do I do nothing and then I can trade with the U.S., or do I put in a GDPR-like rule and then I can do both U.S. and Europe, right? So it's kind of the highest common denominator is winning out.
Susan?
I want to pick up a little bit on the evangelizing. I served on the Federal Communications Commission during the 90s. Oftentimes people have referred to it as the golden age of the Federal Communications Commission, from 94 to 2001. And during that period of time, we had at the time, beginning, two mobile phone companies. Tim Berners-Lee had maybe a year or two earlier had introduced World Wide Web. We were taking everything from analog to digital on all lanes of what we used to call the superhighway, information superhighway. Cable modem service had just begun, had just been launched. We had the 1996 Telecom Act, which introduced competition into video and telephony. We had Children's Television Act. We had the E-rate. We introduced auctions. And game theory. We had the flexible use of the spectrum was one of our basic underlying policies, and we spent a lot of time, if you will, proselytizing the notion that there should be an independent regulatory agency and that there should be privatization of telephone networks, which at the time were largely government-owned. And yet, looking back at that period of time versus where we are today, we were moving at a snail's pace. It was like driving on the Beltway during rush hour. Versus being in a Tesla on an open highway, an open system. We move today at such a rapid clip. We're going from an internet economy, we've gone already to a digital economy, and it has a profound impact on everything. So what does this mean for government regulation? Essentially, it means by the time you put pen to paper, that technology has already gone by, and we're into another system of technologies, or new ideas are floating up that are going to make a huge difference. So what do you do about this? you have to be so careful. We knew back in the 90s the unintended consequences of over-regulation or jumping in too fast. That was the basis for our cable modem service, very light regulation. To allow technologies to have their run, we emphasized competition. We emphasized innovation, even though we didn't talk about innovation as such back then. To enable players and new players to come in, we did try to get the underdogs to be able to have an opportunity to compete, and that was, in fact, where we were coming from. All of those principles, it seems to me, still are relevant today, and even more so where things are changing so rapidly. So what do? You bring people together. You have, hopefully, when we're dealing with the European Union, on both sides of the pond, try to get people to think about the issues when they're first being discussed. As we're looking at all of these verticals, be they smart cities or self-driving cars, whatever it may be, because it's going to hit every single vertical, every single industry. Let's think about, before you start to regulate, bring everybody together, have the conversations, do the research together. If you're going to have a workshop, bring folks from Europe into the workshop and vice versa. So that, not so that you regulate the same, that you try to get everything to be the same, but rather, so you start with the basic understanding of the issues that we are facing. And at every turn, you bring consumers into the conversation. So emphasizing, for me, emphasizing multi-stakeholder approach to things, so identify the problems, and chances are there's a great opportunity for technology to make the solutions available and to do it more rapidly than a regulatory process would do. Avoid the top-down approach wherever possible. And again, use the multi-stakeholder approach to doing things, which doesn't mean the government's not involved. It is involved and should be a player, but in a different way. Also, I would look to eliminate one thing that oftentimes we talk about, and that is the notion, a combination of three words, level playing field. Everybody argues for a level playing field. I think it's virtual reality. They're looking through the, the goggles. We need to avoid that because everybody has their own issues and their own benefits coming either because they had been in existence beforehand and had the benefit of government funding for their networks, or because they weren't regulated before in some other fashion and they have some benefits. So let's talk in a different way in terms of how we bring about competition in the marketplace. And I think that will do a lot to help all of us globally succeed because we are so very much interconnected.
So, Susan, you pointed out that when you were at the commission in the 90s and about 2001 and so, it was an era of experimentation, letting the marketplace work, less regulation was a key mantra there. And I know you, during that time, were very active internationally in talking about these issues. I know you can't speak for the Hillary campaign, but you've been actively involved in these things. Do you see, assuming Adams' numbers are right, that if she's elected, do you see a return, a back to the future? Do you see an international effort by a new administration to talk about less regulation and greater experimentation? Or are we going to continue, as one of the panels yesterday talked about, increased regulation in all these various areas?
You were correct. I do not speak for the Clinton administration, should there be a new Clinton administration going forward. However, I would say she certainly is going to be looking for the best ideas. I think she certainly is going to be looking to bring about and to continue to bring about competition in the marketplace. I know certainly if everybody or anybody wants, they can see where her policies are in technology. All they have to do is go to hillaryclinton.com and click on policies, and you'll see a 7, 10-page, whatever it is, memo listing where she would be coming from. But I think she also is very cognizant of, and this is Hillary herself, she gets these issues. She's very cognizant about how rapidly things are changing. And she's going to want to try to bring parties together in the first instance to solve those problems. She's going to want to bring funding to the table to try to help innovation and basic sciences so that more and more of these opportunities come to the fore. I think one of the things that she's keen about doing is then making sure that the private sector can then pick up on these technologies that are created by the DARPAs of government, so that there are more opportunities out there for new ideas to be spawned.
Perfect. Wolfgang?
Well, let's hope for that. So some deregulation would be helpful in Europe, of course. But when I thought about this panel, I came to different conclusions, as this panel is so broad. Before I come to my points, maybe some remarks on what has been discussed until now. I was surprised to hear that your government wasn't tough enough in lobbying against this data protection regulation. I think you overdone it. And you did it, you were much too aggressive, also to the detriment of the European industry, because this all resulted in the European Parliament in very irrational reactions, which in the end brought us regulation also on big data, which is really hindering innovation in Europe, and which is not very helpful. At the same time, there is, I think, a big difference in mentality between the two economies, and especially in my country, Germany. I mean, people are somehow obsessed with data protection, their privacy. So that must be taken into account. You can't just say, well, that's hindering business. So I would add a word of caution that maybe a different lobbying would have been more successful and not even more aggressive lobbying. When I thought about this panel, I thought it's an impossible title, but there's one really important issue. If you talk about digitization, the next big step is ubiquitous connectivity. That's what we call the Internet of Things. And in Germany, we call it Industry 4.0. We are still an industrialized country, so we think this is the next industrial revolution. And there are 2 points, apart from what has been discussed now, which is, in my view, very decisive for the further development of this Internet of Things. The first thing is, and we already heard that from Michael Daniel, it's cybersecurity. I think the security issues are very underestimated by our industry so far. I mean, the ICT industry so far has been pretty poor to look at the issues. And we think, as Deutsche Telekom, that we need much more security by design, also when it comes to standardization and privacy by design, if we want to make that happen. The other big issue, or maybe I stay with one sentence to that, I think that needs also global coordination. That needs discussions on both sides of the Atlantic, how we do that. And just to give you an example, there's still a big hesitance to make cyber attacks public, or even behind the scenes public, to discuss the answers. Such things might be regulated in the end, but we need to find ways how to respond to such threats. The other big thing is standardization of 5G. Listening to many statements in the past days about 5G, I get the impression that many people over here still think 5G is the 5th generation of mobile. We don't think this is true. We think 5G is a true network revolution. 5G is software-defined networks. It's ubiquitous connectivity. We are calculating 1 million devices per square kilometer in densely populated areas in 2030. You must make that happen. We have low latency, ultra-high bandwidth. All these issues need to be standardized, but that's more than standardization. You need to discuss the use cases, and that's something which happens already outside 3GPP. One recent example we just announced as Deutsche Telekom is an alliance with South Korean Telecom, AT&T, Qualcomm, Nokia, and Ericsson, and we invite others to join to get this standardization along use cases done. And I think that will be the one of the important talks in the next 2 years when you talk tech policy and also regulation, because this country here has one big advantage. 5G needs ubiquitous connectivity also with regard to fiber. And you have unregulated fiber networks, while in Europe everything is regulated. And that's a big obstacle. So you're advanced as well. Thank you.
Wolfgang, let me follow up if I could. So part of the points that you were just making is how ubiquitous this needs to be, and by ubiquitous I think it sounds global. Are you looking, is Deutsche Telekom looking to governments to get together to try to establish these global rules? Do you see industry forums being effective in being able to do this? What's the path forward so that we can have that sort of future?
I think the industry forums are key for driving it forward and really making the right proposals. But then governments need to come in. I mean, we have the spectrum issues, of course, and that's only on the government level, which need to be discussed, but also the issues involving vertical. For example, rules on automated cars. I mean, that's something which is the next big thing. There the European Union is already having some roundtables and strong views, which I think are compatible with the thinking over here. So it would be good if the government start discussing this as well.
Terrific. Matt?
Thanks very much. So I think in the panel so far, there are sort of two major strands. One is darkness and one is light. And I'd like to talk a little bit about each one. When a colleague of mine gives his parade of horribles speech, he refers to it as his winter is coming set of remarks. And the funny thing about choosing a seasonal analogy as the title for your speech is that it changes depending on the location. So in April, when I flew from beautiful sunny Washington, where flowers were starting to bloom, and went to Boston and delivered this set of remarks, I called it April in Boston, which was about as close to hell as I could possibly imagine. And I think it's probably also appropriate, given where we are and where many of us have come from, that maybe today we could refer to it as August in Washington. So thank you, David, for the opportunity to speak here today and get out of the humidity in Washington. So the parade of horribles. So the first one that I would talk about is an increase in blocking that we're seeing globally. So I won't ask for audience response to this, but my guess, if I asked you, how many times have Facebook or WhatsApp, which is owned by Facebook, been blocked in 2016? You might say, I've read a couple of times about blocks in Brazil, maybe a handful, maybe 2 or 3. The number of blocks that we have tracked since the start of 2016 is 28. And I say we have tracked because I assume that there are some more that we actually are not aware of. That's governments shutting off our services or shutting off certain types of services, like blocking VoIP in countries in the Middle East, for instance. The fear that we have about blocking is that actually it's getting easier and easier over time for governments to do that. So when I started at Facebook in 2011, my first week on the job, Egypt shut off the internet. And a couple of years later, I said, that hasn't happened in the last couple of years. Like Egypt shut off the internet for five days, massive economic disruption, front page news in the New York Times. And then I started paying more attention and realizing that it's happening all of the time. And the reason that it's less frequently reported is because blocks are happening in more targeted duration and more targeted regions. So India will block the internet in a particular state simply because students are taking exams that day and it wants to reduce the likelihood that people cheat. That enables governments to engage in blocking more frequently, with the cost of each individual block being diminished, but the aggregate costs of blocking overall are actually increased. So this is something that we're very concerned about when your mission is to make the world more open and connected. You can't do that when your service is blocked. There are a variety of other concerns that we have as well. So again, when I started at Facebook in 2011, Freedom House was in its early years of releasing a Freedom on the Net report, where it tracks internet freedom globally. Every year since then, the trajectory has been downward. Internet freedom is getting more and more constrained. We're seeing more and more laws all over the world where governments are seeking to impose their laws extraterritorially. So that's happening in countries like Russia, but it's also happening in countries like the United Kingdom. We're seeing more and more arrests of employees. That's, again, we had a Facebook employee was arrested in Brazil in February. We're seeing data localization proposals, as Julie mentioned, not just in countries in Europe, but also in more problematic regimes. We're seeing countries throughout the world look to suppress the kinds of ways that people can express themselves online, and looking to do that not just through enforcement of their own laws against companies, but also through outside their own laws and seeking to enforce them in that way. We're also seeing an increase in the number of law enforcement demands that we receive. So if you look at any of the transparency reports that companies like mine or companies like Adams are doing, the number of requests that we receive to provide user data in response to law enforcement inquiries are continually on the rise. So that's a pretty bleak picture, I think, or if I've done it well, it's a bleak picture. I think there is also some chance, some opportunities that we're seeing moments of light. So at 5:30 a.m. this morning, I got in a car with a colleague and a friend, and we drove up to Maroon Bells to see alpenglow off of the peak. So for those of you who don't know, sunrise in the mountains, the sun comes up actually over the horizon, and as it's coming over the horizon, it hasn't yet exceeded the height of the ridges in the area, and so as it slowly, and so you're standing in darkness and you can see the sky starting to get light. And then as the sun gets just over the ridge, the mountains, before it's daylight, the mountains turn bright pink. And that lasts for 5, 10, 15 minutes. And then the sun comes up over the ridge and it's day. And I think there are reasons to think that we might actually be in that moment in the tech policy sector of standing in the darkness but beginning to see glimmers of light. The one that I think that I've gotten to experience the most closely in the last couple of months is participating in the process of thinking through what a different approach might be to law enforcement requests. So currently, companies are not permitted to respond to demands for content, meaning the content of your email account or photos or videos. We are not permitted by US law to respond to a foreign demand for content. So there are lots of situations you can imagine where that would be a desirable thing. There's a request that's inconsistent with global human rights norms. Countries are looking to suppress speech. They're looking to get access to information in cases that would be problematic from a human rights or privacy perspective. But then there are other cases where there's a murder in France, and the French government is seeking to prosecute that murder under French law, and it believes that an internet company is holding that data, and we are unable to respond directly to a request from the French government because of US law. So there's currently a mutual legal assistance treaty process that the foreign government can go through, but that process is really slow. It takes an average of 10 months for companies to be able to provide access to the information. So we've worked through a multi-stakeholder initiative with civil society organizations, a lot of discussions with the US government and with the UK government to develop an alternate approach where companies would be allowed to respond directly to foreign governments for requests for content when those requests and those countries have demonstrated consistency with global human rights norms. It was really exciting to see, I think it was mid-July, a couple of weeks ago, the US government released draft authorizing legislation that would result in lifting the bar in US law that prevents us from responding to those requests, and seeing embedded in that draft law a balancing between a respect for foreign governments' ability to get access to data. It gives clear weight to the legitimacy of that, as well as a potential set of norms that could govern these sets of requests to ensure that we're able to do it in a way that's consistent with human rights law. It's a glimmer of light. It's a small amount of pink on the mountain, but it's exciting.
Well, terrific. I'm always pleased to hear there's some glimmer of light. And we'll forever now think about the maroon bell moment here. But along those lines, Matt, are you seeing, from your perspective, taking your two sides, is the derivative really positive, are you seeing? Because you see things like this ability to respond.
Yeah.
Or are you seeing greater fragmentation, greater shutdown, as the internet becomes more ubiquitous in people's lives globally?
Yeah, so I think that we need a release of the tension. And so the thing that we are most optimistic about this alternate framework for cross-border requests is that it provides some mechanism to resolve the tension that we face. If we can't reply to requests, and governments in legitimate law enforcement inquiries have to go through the US government in a process that takes 10 months, we think we're gonna see more blocks, we're gonna see more arrests, we're gonna see more data localization laws. So I think we need to burst the balloon. If we don't do that and there isn't some release of pressure in the system, then I think there's darkness ahead.
So let me open up for the panel generally, and I'm sure Julie will jump in on this immediately. So in the early days of the internet, there was an assumption that as the internet spread globally, that there'd be a great commonality amongst policies, people, industries, developments, and so forth. But as I listened to virtually all of the presentations, we're seeing data localization, we're seeing greater privacy that are geographically expressed. We see a whole series of things that seem to divide the internet into more geographically specific and focused areas rather than on a global basis. We hear Wolfgang talk about the fact that we need to have some of these things be done on a global basis, or they're either not going to happen or they'll be happening in a very bad way because of the economics and so forth. So where are we going with this writ large? Are we heading for greater globalization, or are we devolving into what some people refer to as the splinter net or other sort of geographically based? Julie, why don't you start off, and then we can, I know Adam wants to jump in as well.
Oh, I'll defer to, go for it.
I don't think there's any doubt that we have splinter nets. I mean, that is the reality of what we have now. The cyber utopian vision that, you know, the internet was going to erase all kind of national boundaries or legal boundaries, it's just not true. I mean, I do think there's been there have been some very positive developments in terms of a greater expectation of free expression in many countries. Although, you know, again, there's probably been a reaction to that as well. So I don't think that we have splinter nets. We have different national laws that internet services have to respond to. That's the situation we have today. And I think that's primarily a function of the fact that national governments, rightly, I think, want to make sure that the internet respects national values, whatever they may be. By the way, I don't think this precludes my evangelization proposal. I do think the U.S. still ought to evangelize our approach. It may not be successful, but I think we should not be bashful about our approach. But we do have to recognize that these splinter nets, whether it's in free expression or other areas, are the result of national governments trying to sort of hold on to national values, whatever they may be.
Wolfgang.
I think it's an inevitable development with regard to the application of laws, because the internet has grown up a little, I would say. We started with instant scalability, and that means each service was available worldwide. And suddenly, legal systems apply their rules, which is, I mean, that's common in trade. And why shouldn't it be common in internet? Where we should be very careful is really start protectionism. And I'm really concerned, as you are, that there are tendencies in Asia and Russia and developing countries where the internet is shut down. I don't see that for Europe, apart from this discussion on data, but that's, I think, not really related to a trade issue. So I would plead for also international advocacy to keep that open.
Julie?
So yeah, I don't know where we're. I don't have a crystal ball. I wish I did. I'm sure all of us wish we did. But I do think that there has long been regional differences in terms of consumer protection laws, in terms of criminal laws, and it does make sense in many ways for some of those provisions to move to the internet. I mean, the real issue is extraterritorial application of those rules. I mean, I think companies have been able to deal with, for instance, data breach notification laws in the United States. And it's not, a lot of people I know in this audience are very unhappy with the patchwork quilt, but it's been around for 10 years, and companies have figured out how to do it. And basically, they typically will notify based on the most aggressive law that's out there. I think the problem arises both through extraterritorial application of law, which I want to talk about how much the U.S. does that. I mean, I don't think we can get involved in a do what we say, not what we do kind of position, because the U.S. is very extraterritorial in application of many, many laws. But the problem arises with respect to extraterritoriality when the values clash, when you really can't comply with both. And I think the biggest, the most poignant example of that is in the right to be forgotten. That's where I think this regionalization and the application of these regional rules globally becomes problematic, because companies and governments are really having a hard time sort of figuring out who wins out in that circumstance. But in terms of extraterritoriality, I mean, you think about the Federal Trade Commission. The Federal Trade Commission was often and is often going after foreign companies that are harming U.S. citizens based on U.S. law. The IRS is constantly looking globally. Think about the FIFA investigation now that DOJ has underway. I mean, FIFA does exist in the United States, but barely. I mean, we barely play soccer. It's really an international issue. So, the United States has not been shy at all about exercising its long-arm jurisdiction, right? I mean, it's done it forever. And now what we're seeing is through the GDPR and through other rules, other regions wanting to do the same thing. And that's where the clash will happen in areas like automated processing will be one area, and right to be forgotten will be another.
Susan?
I was going to make the same point that Julie just made with respect to extraterritoriality and issues where it is a clash of values. I would take us back, however, that we've come a long way towards globalization with the internet, and sure, there's going to be some backing off and some reconfiguration, but a lot of the values that have been the underpinning of the internet are ones that we are, in fact, bringing other people to fight for, and we need to bring other people to fight for, and that's the freedom of speech, human rights, and those kinds of issues. And they are starting to catch on at a lot more rapid pace than had ever been possible before. So I would take the sunrise being glorious in that respect. But I would also add on a cloud,
You're supposed to start on cloud and end up light.
Blocking it. I want to bring this up because this is an issue that we haven't really talked about, I don't think, at this conference, and that is the internet facilitating things like harassment, particularly so many women who are absolutely abused on the internet, threatened in all kinds of ways. A lot of that can be addressed, and I hope would be addressed by the private sector working together to try to combat that kind of harassment that takes place and is facilitated by the networks.
And I would just add that's clearly a global phenomenon.
It is.
Let me open up
and we're now knowing about it more because it is, the information's available globally.
Terrific. Let me just open up for a quick question or so before we've got one here from Bob.
In a sense, this might be, I'm Bob Crandall from TPI in Brookings. Might be a question for the next panel, but there's no European on the next panel, so I'm going to ask a question of Wolfgang. In going back over what's been happening on network deployment, which is an issue that hasn't come up at all, maybe in this conference, in Europe, I now see national governments launching national, often called national broadband plans, digital economy plans, whatever, with large planned government subsidies for deployment of network facilities, something that we thought we'd moved away from years ago. And I'm wondering if we're going to come back to more government subsidy, not only in networks, but in downstream activities, which may be a cause of substantial global friction. Most immediately, maybe with Vodafone or with Liberty Global, if these subsidies are granted only to national carriers or nationally owned carriers in those countries.
Well, there's indeed a tendency towards more subsidies. There's also what they call the Juncker plan on European level, but that's mainly loan guarantees, so it's no direct subsidy. At the same time, many governments do something which is not very helpful, so I can assure you there won't be a competition issue in the end. They start financing their own networks. So we have a very unfortunate tendency that there are a lot of governments who think they are better in deploying fiber quickly than the network companies. And so what we are seeing also in Germany is a lot of distorted competition, local governments financing fiber on a large scale. So we are rather having an issue with that than benefiting from subsidies.
Any other questions from the audience? Let me just sort of end. Oh, is there one over here? Oh,
Hi there.
sorry, thank you.
Jules Polonetsky at FPF. Wolfgang, but also the others, because you've all been very active in Europe. Wolfgang mentioned that the U.S. efforts in Europe were almost counterproductive in lobbying around the GDPR because of how they came off and were perceived. What then do you think is the effective way for U.S. organizations to be fully heard and do so in a way that is locally and culturally appropriate? Julie, obviously, as well as other FTC folks, were all over a lot, and I think were very welcome interlocutors, but obviously there were other examples where you feel it was counterproductive. What's the right way then to press these issues in a strong way that is going to be received in a productive manner?
Well, hindsight 21 is always easy, but I think the major mistake was in the beginning that the US organizations went against this notion of broader data protection, which is something where the majority of the European people would subscribe to. There's a different mentality. I think many Europeans believe that the state protecting them is the right way to look at it, while over here you do not really trust the state, and you think a private company is best suited to protect your privacy, something which is very few people in Europe would subscribe to. So if you had focused on the business models like big data, everybody would have benefited a lot. And that has been done later, but too lately. But as I say, I mean, retrospectively, it's always easy. Yeah.
So I do agree with you that I think one of the issues was that many of the advocates, and I don't actually think this was necessarily the U.S. government, but rather U.S. entities, didn't go into the conversation respecting the fundamental rights approach, and failed to acknowledge that Europe really does take privacy seriously, and often the conversation devolved into a competition issue, which I don't think necessarily helped the conversation. But I want to turn this around, and so I do think that more could have been done, and hindsight is 20/20. But just to turn this around, Wolfgang, I want to push back a little bit in a very friendly way to say that I think the German government could have done more here too. And I've spoken with people inside the Ministry of Interior and the Ministry of Justice within Germany. You know, Germany has a very, very important role within the European conversation, and it's going to only grow now with Brexit, which we haven't really even mentioned yet. All of the commissioners within the European Commission have as their chiefs of staff a German, more or less, all the major commissioners, or they are German themselves. So the German pipeline between, the pipeline between what is happening in Berlin and what is happening in Brussels is very robust. And I have talked to some of the people about, for instance, why did the German government not file an amicus in the Schrems case? Right? I mean, the German government should have filed an amicus. The U.S. government should have too. Don't get me wrong. But I just want to point out that I think the German government has been shy about exercising its or voicing what I truly believe is a somewhat moderating voice in terms of balancing business interests and consumer interests and privacy, fundamental rights interests. And the German government, for perhaps cultural reasons and whatnot, hasn't really stepped up to the plate in terms of voicing what it believes should be the outcome in Europe. So now we're going to have a challenge to standard contractual clauses. And the US government has filed to be an amicus. So the US government will be there. EPIC and other advocacy groups have filed to be an amicus. The German government hasn't and didn't and won't. So, and frankly, standard contractual clauses are a much, much bigger deal for Germany than they are for the United States. Standard contractual clauses, for those of you who don't know, and pardon me for being legalistic for a moment, but if you want to transfer data out of Europe, you have to have an adequacy mechanism. Safe Harbor was one, it was invalidated, now Privacy Shield is in place. But that only applies to data being transferred between a European country and the United States. For Germany or any other European country, if they want to transfer data, not just to the United States, but say to Russia, to Brazil, to anywhere, they have to have an adequacy decision. There are only about 14 jurisdictions that have been deemed to be adequate per se. So if you want to transfer data as a German company to India or China, you need standard contractual clauses to do it, more or less. I mean, there's some exceptions. If standard contractual clauses are invalidated, it's going to have a huge impact on Germany. So I just want to mention that everybody ought to be, in a very sensitive way, vocalizing the views that will put forward their constituents' best interests, and that definitely applies to the United States in doing it in a sensitive way, but also to some European countries too.
Well, that's true, but there was a funny game going on during the negotiation of the data protection regulation, because on a director level, Germany sent very liberal people who were singled, and you know them, and we spoke about them, and they were singled out in press by some very radical politicians as the biggest obstacle to true data protection. And then they were fighting against the Minister of Interior. So a nasty game started, and that stopped the government to be very vocal. That was an interesting game. On the on the clauses, I think the Federation of German Industries and the vast majority of the government has a look at it, and it will support that. You can be sure.
Oh, sure. I know they do.
I mean, they do a lot.
And I know they're deeply worried about the case, which will ultimately get to the European Court of Justice. But to my knowledge, they have. I mean, maybe at the European Court of Justice they'll be much more active than in Ireland.
It's always good to end on the European Court of Justice. We've gone over time. So that will be our starting for next year's panel, perhaps. So I think we should all thank this extraordinary panel.